The next one is trade receivables turnover ratio. Trade receivables, which is inclusive of trade debtors and bills receivable. Together we call as trade receivables. Okay. Now, trade receivable turnover ratio is nothing but the comparison between your credit sale and average trade receivable. Okay. So here credit revenue from operations. Before itself I said revenue from operation means sale. So credit revenue from operation means credit sales divided by average trade receivable. So trade receivable is inclusive of debtors and bills receivable. How would we find out the average trade receivable? Average trade receivable is equal to opening trade receivables plus closing trade receivables divided by 2. For example, here you will have to be very careful in calculating this average trade receivables. Okay, I'll tell you what. First, when you are given opening debtors, closing debtors, opening bills receivable, closing bills receivable, all the 4 accounts are given. Okay, that is opening trade debtors, opening bills receivable, closing trade debtors, closing bills receivable, all the 4 accounts are given. In that case, add all the 4 accounts and divide it by 2, that is opening all the balances of trade debtors and bills receivable plus closing trade debtors and bills receivable divided by 2. Okay. For example, if you are given only closing debtors and closing bills receivable, okay, that is only the closing balances of trade receivables are given, in that case you need not divide it by 2. Okay, instead you can take the closing balances as your average. It is just the same like your inventory. There also I said opening or closing, if any one account alone is given, in that case we'll take that particular amount as the average. I shown you the tutorial note there. Okay, the same thing must be followed even in the trade receivables turnover ratio also. And if opening balances of trade receivables are given, that is debtors and bills receivable are given, in that case also you need not divide it by 2. Instead, add up those two values and take it as an average. Okay, and next is, so as I said, credit revenue from operations is your net credit sales. And when the trade receivables ratio, turnover ratio is more or greater, it shows that the business is able to collect all its dues from the customers, that is they are able to efficiently collect the dues from the customers. Okay, here again tutorial note, in the absence of opening trade receivables, which means your opening balances are not given, closing trade receivables can be taken instead of average trade receivables, which means your closing trade receivables is your average trade receivable. But you should not change this term and all here. You should write as it is. The calculation alone will vary. Okay. Like your inventory conversion period, you also have something called debt collection period, which means the time taken to collect the amount due from the customers. Okay, that is called as debt collection period. So when the debt collection period is very less, in that case the management is able to collect its debt very easily and very efficiently within a shorter period. Okay, now debt collection period in days. Number of days in a year divided by trade receivables turnover ratio, which means number of days in a year is 365 divided by whatever we find in the trade receivables turnover ratio, that is to be taken. Same way, debt collection period in months. If it is asked in months, number of months in a year divided by trade receivables turnover ratio. Okay. Now, I'll explain illustration 9. The credit revenue from operations of Harini Limited amounted to 9,60,000. This is your credit revenue from operations. Okay, and its debtors and bills receivable at the end of the accounting period amounted to rupees 1 lakh and rupees 60,000 respectively. So here you have only the debtors and bills receivable, but at the end of the accounting period alone is given, which means only the closing trade receivables are given. So in that case you need not calculate the average trade receivables. You can add these two values and consider it as average trade receivables. Okay, you are asked to calculate trade receivables turnover ratio and also collection period in months. Okay, so now trade receivables turnover ratio is equal to credit revenue from operations divided by average trade receivables. Okay, so now we have our revenue from credit revenue from operations directly in the sum, which is 9,60,000. So it's always better you write credit revenue from operations is equal to 9,60,000. Okay, then you need to calculate average trade receivables. Since you do not have opening balances of debtors and bills receivable, you need not find average trade receivable. Okay, instead write trade receivable is equal to debtors plus bills receivable, that is 1 lakh plus 60,000. You'll get 1,60,000, right? So this is your average trade receivables. Here you see closing trade receivables are taken instead of average trade receivables, as the opening trade receivables are not given. So which means your opening debtors and opening bills receivable are not given. So you're treating your closing debtors and bills receivable together as your average trade receivables. Okay, you need not divide this by 2, right? Then apply this in the formula. So 9,60,000 divided by 1,60,000, so you get 6. Okay, so again turnover ratios should always be written in the form of times, so we'll write this as 6 times. Okay, you are also asked to calculate the collection period, debt collection period in months. Okay, so we'll write debt collection period is equal to number of months in a year divided by trade receivables turnover ratio. So how many number of months we have? We have totally 12 months in a year. So 12 divided by trade receivable turnover ratios, we found it as 6 times. So divided by 6, you get 2 months as your debt collection period.